Next up, this is our third talk this morning. This is from Professor Kevin Quinn and Jerry Yu from the Department of Political Science. They will be talking about modeling truthfulness.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So this project started out in the fall of 2019. And at the time, Jerry and I were really interested in a purely methodological problem of how can we write down statistical models for pairwise comparisons data where the people doing the comparisons differ in how they're perceiving the relevant attributes of the objects. By about March 2020, it became apparent to us that people's perceptions of truthfulness of COVID-19 statements might well be a very good application of the models. And so that's the results that we're going to show you today. Okay, so as I noted, this is joint work with Jerry, Qiushi, and Jerry's going to be doing the last half of the presentation. I'll be doing the first part. So two sort of big goals here. One is purely methodological, is to think about how we could write down interesting probability models for how people perceive essentially any set of objects that they can make pairwise comparisons about. Okay, we'll see some examples of that in a second. And then the substantive application here is to try to get a better sense of how people in the US, the voting age population in the US, what sort of things seem to structure their views of the truthfulness of statements made about coronavirus COVID-19. So to sort of foreshadow what Jerry's going to give you more detail about later, the model seems to work pretty well. So that's certainly nice. But substantively, there's some interesting things here as well. So excuse me. So one thing that's interesting, I think, is that the modal respondent in the survey that we're going to show you some results from turns out that they're not very swayed by partisanship, but these folks have a very difficult time making accurate judgments about the actual truthfulness of statements made about COVID-19. So they're not hyper-partisans, but they're also not very good at deciphering what's true and what's not true. On the other hand, there are a pretty sizable fraction of respondents, both on the right and on the left, who seem to be viewing all the statements about COVID-19 through partisan lenses. In other words, someone on the right, if a statement is made in a right-leaning way by a right-leaning speaker, it's going to be true, and something made by a left-leaning speaker is going to be false. And so these folks are not really very good at deciphering the actual truthfulness of statements, but their statements are highly predictable. It's very clear how you would want to predict how these people would view statements about COVID-19. And it seems to boil down to their partisanship as well as the partisanship of the speakers. Okay, so quickly, I want to sort of very quickly run through what the study design looks like. And then Jerry's going to talk a little bit about some models, that old standard models, as well as some new models and the results. Just really quickly to just foreshadow one thing Jerry's going to spend more time on is that the typical way that people model pairwise comparisons data, the attributes are assumed to lie in a one-dimensional, assumed to lie on a line, okay? And so that works well for many things, but in this example, it's not going to work so well because some people are really trying to gauge the actual truthfulness of things. Other people seem to be guided largely by their partisan affiliations. And so it's a much more complicated sort of latent space that seems to be organizing the perceptions of these statements. Okay, so in order to do something with this, we need a pool of statements that have been made about COVID-19. And in particular, we'd like statements that have been fact-checked, so we have some sense of whether they're actually true or actually false. We'd also like a mix of both true and false statements. And because we think that this might be related to partisan politics in the US right now, or over the summer when we did this study, we'd also like a mix of statements that have sort of a rightward leaning valence, some with a leftward leaning valence, and some that don't have a clear right or left slant. So luckily, politifact.com is a website that provides exactly what we need, okay? And so if you're interested, you can go to the site itself. There's a separate section on coronavirus, but this is sort of what you would see. And so you see a bunch of statements, and then there are a bunch of journalists at PolitiFact who've actually done fairly extensive fact checking of all of these things and given labels to how truthful these statements are. So this is going to give us the source of our data for the pairwise comparisons. And in particular, we're going to try and balance the truthfulness, the valence of these statements. Okay, and so we're going to have 7 low truth, right valence statements, 7 high truth, right valence statements, et cetera, for all of these combinations. So the survey was done in early July 2020. We recruited respondents from Lucid with quotas to make the sample representative of the US voting age population. We ended up with a little over 2,500 respondents, and each of the respondents on average gave us their views on just less than 15 pairs of randomly selected statements. Okay, and so this is what the survey interface looked like. This is just an example of what, right, something that a survey respondent might have seen, and they would have seen, right, a sequence of these, but they'd be asked to tell us which of these is relatively more truthful. Okay, so the important thing to note here is, unlike a situation where we'd be asking for like Likert scale ratings of a single statement, where we might say on a scale of 1 to 5, how truthful is a statement? Here, all the comparisons are relative. And in particular, it could be the case that there are 2 statements that are false, but we're asking to make a judgment of which of them is more false or more truthful. Okay. Also, as part of the survey, we collected a bunch of demographic information, the usual information about political attitudes. And because we were interested in whether people's perceptions of these statements had any kind of association with behavior, we also recorded some self-reported behavioral measures on things like mask wearing and social distancing. Okay, and so Jerry will tell you a little bit more about the model and the results at this point.
Okay, I will carry on introducing the model we're going to use for analyzing the data. So before introducing the newly proposed model, let's look at the standard pairwise comparison model in the literature. Thurston model is one of the basic pairwise comparison model. First of all, we assume that all the objects for comparison have their location on a unidimensional latent real number line. And then we assume that every respondent judges a pairwise comparison by taking a difference between the attributes, the latent attributes of 2 objects. And then for all the binary comparison data, we assume there is a Bernoulli data generation process, and then the difference between objects' latent attributes determines the probability of the Bernoulli distribution. And then we specifically use a probit link to connect the difference and the probability. One variation of this model is to add reader-specific parameters.
I believe Jerry may have frozen. Yeah, it looks like we just lost Jerry for a second. He'll probably try to rejoin in just a moment.
If not, Kevin, are you still on? Would you be able to, if he has longer term issues, finish the
Yeah.
talk?
Yep, I can take over if Jerry's not back on in 30, 40 seconds or something like that.
Okay.
In the interest of keeping things moving, should I start up, and then if Jerry connects back again, we can turn it back over to him?
Yeah, please do. We'll keep an eye on the panelist to see if he logs back in, and feel free to take another 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I think this is where Jerry was. So the sort of standard models for pairwise comparisons go back to the 1920s, 1930s. And they're pretty straightforward models. The key thing is that we're rating a bunch of objects, OJ, J through 1 to capital J. Each object has a latent attribute, theta J, and that's assumed to be somewhere on the real line. And then the probability that a particular person says that object J has more of some attribute than object J prime is going to look like this, right? So the Thurston model, F is the normal CDF, the Bradley-Terry model, F is a logistic CDF, okay? And so that oftentimes works well. You can make that a little bit more complicated and allow for some heterogeneity in terms of how raters see the world by adding a parameter that just rescales this. But it's everything is still on a line. Okay. Typically, people assume that these beta parameters, these individual specific parameters, are positive. In other words, people see the world in the same way. They're just more or less sensitive to whatever the underlying stimuli are coming out of these objects. In our example, we can also let the betas be anywhere on the real line, in which case, right, some people, what some people perceive to be true, other people perceive to be false, right? It turns out these models are not going to work very well for the data that we're looking at, because they're either going to allow us to see, to model truthfulness, but not partisanship, or model partisanship, but not truthfulness. We can't sort of get both in the same model. Okay, so the new model that we've been working on assumes that instead of each of these objects having a location somewhere on R1, now each of these objects has a two-dimensional latent attribute. We can make that higher dimensional, but to keep things simple, we'll just say that each object has some latent attribute in R2. And what's going to be happening is each person's judgment depends on how that person projects these 2 points in R2 onto some line. Okay, and in particular, each rater is going to have a perceptual vector that's going to be in the positive quadrant, and we're going to parameterize that with the parameter gamma. Okay, so gamma is going to be between 0 and pi over 2, and that's just going to give us the angle of this perceptual vector here. Okay, so here are just 2 examples sort of make sense of this. In one case, theta j is up here, theta j prime is down here, and individual I is asked, right, does object j have more of some attribute than object j prime? This individual's perceptual vector is almost parallel to the first dimension, And so when this person projects these points onto that line, we see that object J prime is perceived to have higher values of this latent attribute than object J. On the other hand, there could be another individual whose perceptual vector is pointed up more in this direction. And now when we project these points onto this vector, this person perceives object J to have more of the latent attribute than J prime. Okay, so a key thing in what we're going to be showing you is modeling these perceptual vectors across individuals, as well as the latent locations of the thetas, which are going to correspond to the statements that are made. Okay, so also this is less important for what when we'll show you in a second, but we can also be kind of thoughtful about how we're parameterizing this, and in particular, we're going to assume that these gamma parameters, these angles, these perceptual vectors, that they're going to follow a Dirichlet process, which is going to allow for some clustering among the respondents. And so it's going to essentially do some shrinkage to help us estimate these things more effectively. Okay, so if we look just at the results from the one-dimensional models, they don't work very well. Okay, so if we're just looking at in-sample predictions, right, so this is not any kind of out-of-sample thing or anything like that. The in-sample predictions are pretty bad. They're worse than chance for 26% of the respondents. And these theta values, these latent attributes of the statements, turn out to be only weakly correlated with objective truth. The correlation is about 0.4. If we add this beta parameter I showed you earlier to allow for some kind of difference among the raters, but still keeping everything on a line, now essentially we're just modeling partisanship and not their perception of truth. The correlation with objective truth goes down to 0.3, but the rank order correlation with the political valence of the statement goes up to 0.7 in absolute value. Okay. So, right, we sort of, with simple one-dimensional models, we sort of have a choice of either modeling the truthfulness of the statements and not doing well, or modeling partisanship and completely losing the ability to say anything about the actual truthfulness of the statements. So this is what we see with the new model that we've proposed. So what we've done here is each of these squares corresponds to the latent attributes of a statement. Okay, 2 dimensions. The darkened squares are statements that PolitiFact found to be high in truth value. The open squares are statements that PolitiFact found to be low in truth value. And I have three vectors here. Okay, I'll show you later what the distribution of these gamma parameters looks like. But the important thing to note is that if we look at this vector coming out, that corresponds to gamma 0.7, and then we project these squares onto that vector, this is essentially going to give us the highest correlation with truthfulness. But note that the range, right, of these projected points onto this vector is very, very small. So these probabilities are still going to be very close to 0.5. Okay. On the other hand, if we look at the valence of these statements, and now the red circles correspond to right-leaning statements, the blue triangles correspond to left-leaning statements, and the sort of grayish pluses correspond to not clearly right or left statements. Now we start to see that they clearly separate themselves, right? So here's an individual whose perceptual vector is at the minimum of what we estimate, gamma 0.18. And this person, when projecting this down, note that the blue triangles are all going to be to the right, more or less, of where the red circles would project on this. And so this person is someone who's going to see left-leaning statements as being true regardless of truth value, right-leaning statements as being false regardless of truth value. Same kind of thing is happening up here. So this is the highest value of gamma that we estimate. And so this is someone, when we project these red circles onto this, and these blue triangles onto this person is going to give higher truth value to Republican-leaning or right-leaning statements than left-leaning statements, regardless of the actual truth value of the statements. This is the distribution of what the actual gammas are that we estimated. So these are just this is a histogram of the posterior means. And so the modal person is actually somewhere in here, and right, they're not really that affected by partisanship. but they also, these are the people in that gamma 0.7 category who seem to have a really difficult time of ascertaining what the actual truth or falsity of a statement is. On the other hand, we have people with gamma values up here closer to pi over 2, whose values are very highly correlated with right-leaning partisanship. Republican statements are true, Democratic statements are false. And on the other hand, we have people down here, who view the world oppositely. Left-leaning statements are true, right-leaning statements are false. We can sort of go through and pick particular values of these gamma parameters and look at the correlation with the valence. And we see that as we get higher values of gamma, there's higher positive correlation with right-leaning statements. As we get lower values of gamma, there's a stronger negative correlation with the rightness of the statements. Note, even here, the best we sort of do in modeling truth is on average, we're only getting like a correlation of 0.45 again. So again, people have a really hard time of judging accurately what the actual truth value of a statement is. So here are just some very quick results to sort of show how some other variables relate to these gamma values, these perceptual differences across people. So again, low values of gamma, someone who views things through a Democratic lens. High values of gamma, someone who views something through a more Republican lens. People in the middle, aren't really swayed that much by partisanship. And so one thing we could look at is we asked people about their news media consumption. And so if we use some existing measures of the slant of news organizations, we find, not surprisingly, that as people's gamma values get larger, they tend to consume more right-leaning media. We can also look at some, and we can do the same sort of thing. Like if we look at fraction of strong Republicans, we seem to see the same thing. If we look at self-reported ideology, we see the same sort of thing. But we can also look at some behavioral measures to see if there's any association between people's perceptions of the truthfulness of COVID-19 statements and what they actually report to do. And so there's some very slight evidence here that as you perceive things with more of a Republican lens, you tend to social distance less. And we also asked people, we gave them 9 scenarios where they might consider wearing a mask. And we asked them, in how many of these 9 scenarios would you typically wear a mask? And we see that this goes down from about 4 to something more like 3 as you move from the most Democratic sort of respondent to the most Republican respondent. Okay, so really quickly to wrap up, the model works well. I didn't really show you any evidence of that, but if you're interested, we could talk more about that in the networking session at the end. It's going to be useful for a variety of things, but not just for this COVID example, but again, we can talk more about that later. I think that the key takeaways here is that the modal respondent is actually not a hyperpartisan. But that said, they have a very difficult time figuring out what's true and what's not true about COVID-19. And so that's perhaps good that they're not hyperpartisans, but maybe not so good that they're having a difficult time understanding what's true and what's false. That said, there are a lot of people on both ends of the spectrum who do tend to view the truth or falsity of COVID-19 statements almost very largely through partisan lenses. And I think that's something to certainly be thoughtful about, if not concerned about. And so, partisanship seems to matter quite a bit for a lot of these folks. It also seems to be related to behavioral measures such as mask wearing and social distancing. And again, I think that's at least somewhat concerning if we're thinking that these are things that we need to do to control the pandemic. So that's what I have, and I will turn it back to you, Chris.